Thanks very much, Penelope, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's great to be able to talk about the results from our first public sector scorecard, and it's been great engagement both directly with public sector agencies and importantly the media and the broader community as well to have that highlight. So the great news is 116 public sector's employers required to report met the threshold. Everyone reported, which has been absolutely fantastic. So thank you to many of you on the call who have done the work to achieve that. What we added is nearly 340,000 employees into the WGEA dataset, and it's a world-leading dataset, and having that perspective from the public sector is absolutely vital to continue to enhance and have the insights and learnings as a result. Just in terms, and you'll be familiar, it is structured by the gender equality indicators, which are part of our Act, and we'll be going through some of the results along those lines today as well. It has been quite a journey to get here, and I do want to take the opportunity to acknowledge our partners in the journey. Very importantly, the Public Service Commission, the APSC, have been absolutely vital. And so out of the 116 agencies, 77 already report to the APSC and have used that mechanism to the information that's been provided to the APSC has then been provided by them to us, so that those agencies don't have to report twice. The rest, of course, reported to us directly. But we also did have a group of very early partners to trial this, and that was the Department of Finance, the Department of Treasury, and the Office of the Fair Work Ombudsman, who way back a few years ago went through a pilot with us. And then, of course, about 52 agencies reported voluntarily last year. So thanks for being on the journey with us, and we're really pleased now that this is embedded, obviously legislated, and something that will become regular going forward. And the transparency is really important, and it does bring people in line, the public sector in line with what's happening with the private sector. And I think from a media perspective, what's been really interesting is how much interest that comparison has been. And so to those results, the big headline, of course, that everyone is most interested in is what's the gender pay gap. And for the public sector, it's 13.5. That contrasts to the private sector, which is on average 21.7. So, over 8% gap between the two, and a quite substantial difference, and a reflection of what we know about the public sector, but also a signal that there's more to do. And that does equate to about $19,000 each and every year that on average men are earning more than women. And the team will go through in a bit more detail some of the components in relation to that. Now, we are not in this publication or this time round publishing individual agency gender pay gaps, but we will be doing that next year. And that's just a timing in terms of the legislation, in terms of when that was to be implemented, and the process of doing private sector first and then the public sector afterwards. So lots to do, good headlines, great results from public sector, but definitely some opportunities to work on. I just want to touch on also how this does differ from the APSC REM report. And many of you, as I say, 77 are already reporting to the APSC and get that information. And the APSC does do things differently to how we do it. And that's why that number of 13.5 in terms of the gender pay gap is an unfamiliar number and probably a higher number than you would expect. So APSC, through the REM report, look at composition, the base salary gender pay gap, and senior executive remuneration. What we do through gender equality reporting is we do look at those 6 gender equality indicators. So everything from composition, of course, and remuneration, but also policies and practices, consultation, issues like also sexual harassment and safety at work, those sorts of things as well, and including your composition of your governing body as well. So the WGEA reporting is different from the APSC. The APSC information is, I suppose, largely a subset or incorporated as part of the broader reporting that WGEA does, and APSC captures some other information as well. APSC covers APS employees, whereas we're covering the entire Commonwealth public sector agencies as defined by the PGPA Act. So we include Australia Post, we include NBN, we include CSIRO and so on. And for Defence Force, we've got both the ADF as well as the Department of Defence. So there are many more employees covered by the WGEA reporting. And I think the big difference on the gender pay gap calculation is, of course, the APSC talk about base salary, and they do annualise part-time employees, which we also do, but we like to look at both base salary and total REM. And we think total REM gives a broader perspective in relation to, the take-home earnings that people have, because it takes into account overtime and bonuses and superannuation and all of those sorts of things that might be part of a broader package. And what we do see is a gap between the GPG for base salary and total REM, which reflects some of those differences. So, obviously, I think real value on both perspectives, but important to understand how they're different. And finally, I just want to say what also has been great is we've put each agency's results up on our Data Explorer. And our Data Explorer is this amazing wealth of information. It contains key data points on each of those gender equality indicators. When we publish gender pay gaps, that's where it will go to, but they're not there now. But it also is a mechanism by which you can compare directly to other agencies. So if you're the Department of Finance and want to compare to the Department of Treasury, or if you're, as an example, safety agency or the AFP and want to compare to some maybe private sector type providers, and there may not be, that mightn't be a great example because there mightn't be too many comparisons, but something like an NBN could compare to Telstra, because the Data Explorer has all the individual employers and that capacity to compare over time. So we encourage you to use the Data Explorer, go to the employer results specifically and the compare data function, and then you can see how you're going, how others are going, and where there's direct comparisons to be made, what those outcomes are. So just a high level from me, and now I'm happy to hand over to Celeste and Camilla to get into the detail.
Thanks, Mary. I'll kick us off. And before we jump into running through results GEI by GEI, just to reiterate what employers were captured by the scorecard. So as Mary said, 116 Commonwealth public sector employers reported to us, and that encapsulated 338,951 employees. And this is the breakdown by Commonwealth public sector employer type. So we looked at non-corporate Commonwealth entities, corporate Commonwealth entities, and Commonwealth companies. And you can see it's a non-corporate Commonwealth entity dominated workforce. And there's just a caveat next to that 113, that little asterisk, and that's just because 3 public sector employers did not report their workplace profile data to us, but they did complete the questionnaire, and that was because of exemptions due to being security agencies. So just the numbers do fluctuate occasionally between that. So let's jump into GEI1. So a brief highlight of some of the key findings. So this was the gender composition of the workforce. So the Commonwealth public sector workforce is male dominated, with 56.3% of employees being men. And you can see that breakdown by public sector employer type in this graph. So we found that nearly half of employers are gender balanced, so 48% overall. But the larger male-dominated employers contribute to this heavier gender composition towards being in favour to men. And they do skew our results in some sections, and we do talk about that in a little bit more detail in the scorecard. So when we look at the employment status of employees in the public sector, we find that it's mostly a full-time workforce, with 75% of the workforce working full-time. But when we look at the patterns of women and men, we find that women are more likely to work part-time, so 17% of women work part-time, but men actually are likely to work casually, with 20% of men working casually. And this is where the public sector does differ a little bit to the private sector, where women in the private sector are more likely to work part-time and casually, but this discrepancy of men more likely to work casually is a bit unique to the public sector. And also important to note that only 8% of managers do work part-time. So looking at the management, so in the public sector, management positions overall a gender balance, and that's what this pyramid graph on the left-hand side is showing us and how it compares to the pyramid graph we have created in the private sector on the right-hand side. So 40% of employers have a gender balanced management team, having 40 to 60% women in their management. And as you can see, each of those management levels, all the way from the top of key management personnel, so that's SES band 2 or 3 for APS employers, all the way down to the other manager levels, so that's EL1s, have that 40 to 60% women in those positions. Whereas when we look at the private sector, as you go up that pyramid to the more senior leadership positions, you can see the transition to being a more male-dominated role. So this is a real highlight of success for the public sector, and that is because of the targeted effort and the focus that the public sector has had on creating gender balance in senior leadership positions. So this is something that we really want to highlight as a real a success for these employers. It's a bit of a different story when we look at non-management positions. So we find that women are underrepresented in highly paid, particularly non-manager occupations. And so this graph is showing us the non-manager occupations, but ranked by, at the top, the highest average total REM, and it descends down. So men in blue, we can see that they are more dominant in those top highly paid positions, professionals, technicians, and trade workers, whereas women are more represented down in those lower paid roles, clerical and admin workers, sales workers. So this is definitely an area of improvement that the public sector can focus on, and it actually is also a key driver of the gender pay gap, which we'll talk about in GEI 3. But before that, I think I'm handing back over to Celeste to talk about GEI 2.
Thanks, Camilla. So GEI 2 relates to the composition of governing bodies. What we found in the data is that governing bodies in the public sector are quite different to those in the private sector. So there were two key differences. One was that for most employers, the governing body was reported as their management or executive committee, with fewer employers reporting that they have a board or another kind of governing body. What this means is that for many employers, actions taken to support the workforce composition, particularly in management levels, as Camilla was just speaking to, also supports the composition on governing bodies, where the governing body is the same as their management or executive committee. The other thing we found was that many public sector employers just don't have control over their governing body. This could be because they're appointed by government, or there are other terms about who makes up the governing body that's defined in their legislation. I think despite this, we saw that the governing body's data presented quite a good news story. So when we look at the composition of the governing bodies across the whole data set, we found that women hold approximately half of governing body positions. And then when we look at each individual employer, we found that more than half, approximately 55% of employers, have a gender balanced composition on their governing body. As the table that's up here shows, women hold slightly less than proportional positions for the chair role compared to the number of women members on governing bodies. So there's 51% of members on governing bodies who are women, and women are chairs of about 42%. So it's a little bit less, but it's actually in stark contrast to what we see in the private sector, which is that only 19% of chairs, governing body chairs, are held by women. So this is an area where the public sector is doing well, and I know it's been supported by a lot of government-wide targets and policies and strategies to reach this close to gender balance. I'm going to hand over to Camilla now to talk about the gender pay gap.
Thanks. So as Mary introduced before, the total REM average gender pay gap for Commonwealth public sector employees is 13.5%. So that's what this table is showing us. Also shows the disaggregation by employer type and that comparison to the private sector, notably that it's 8.2 percentage points lower than the private sector, which is sitting at 21.7% most recently from gender equality reporting. So moving on to quartile analysis. So we found that men are 2.5 times more likely to be in the highest earning quartile than women. So this graph shows the upper quartile, middle, upper middle, lower middle, and lower quartile, and the average remuneration for employees in those categories. And we can see 71% of men are sitting in that upper quartile. But notably, the lower quartile is actually gender balanced. So in comparison to the private sector, this is somewhere where the public sector could improve, because in the private sector, men are only 1.9 times more likely to be in the highest earning quartile. So it is another area for improvement in the Commonwealth public sector. And when we look at gender pay gaps for each of the manager and non-manager occupations, we can see that those first 4 manager categories have relatively lower gender pay gaps, particularly the key management personnel one is a great achievement and success in the public sector. Actually, women slightly out earning men at that level. And that's important to note because in the private sector, that is one of the largest gender pay gaps, over 22%. So that is, again, a real notable focus for the public sector and has led to success there. But when we look at those non-manager occupations, so professionals downwards, we can see they have some of the largest gender pay gaps in the public sector. And that is an area of focus and something that the public sector can improve on. So we've introduced employee gender pay gaps. I'm now going to switch to talking about employer gender pay gaps. And that slight difference is previously we were taking all of employee remuneration in a certain group or a certain occupation and looking at the gender pay gap there. In this section, we're going to be talking about employers' median gender pay gap. So each employee's individual median gender pay gap, and then lining them up in order and finding that middle, that typical employer value. So we did a similar analysis for the private sector, their employer gender pay gap snapshot earlier this year. And so we can compare directly that distribution between private and public sector. So this public sector distribution shown in this graph here, we can see the middle value, the typical employer, public sector employer has a median gender pay gap of 6.9%. So that is actually quite close to the target range of plus or minus 5%. That's shown in yellow in this graph. But we can see over 50% of employers do sit above that 6.9% value. So 59% had a median gender pay gap in favour of men, so over 5%, 36% is in that target range, and 4% had a median gender pay gap in favour of women. So that left-hand orange smaller tail of the graph. So when we compare to the private sector, that distribution is actually quite similar, but that 6.9% number is quite different. So in the private sector, that middle, that typical employer median gender pay gap is actually 9.1%. So again, it's just highlighting the success and highlighting the success of the public sector in this space. And finally, for GI3, we'll talk about employer action in this space. So 64% of employers had conducted a pay gap analysis, and subsequently 64% of those had then taken action following that analysis. So those numbers are slightly higher than in the private sector, but it was interesting to note when we looked at reasons why public sector employers had not taken a pay gap analysis, had not subsequently taken action. A lot of those reasonings related to their employees' salaries already being set by workplace agreements, things like EBAs. So it's important to note that that's not a valid reason to not do a pay gap analysis or take action. There are various other factors contributing to gender pay gaps in an organisation, and so it was just an interesting perspective that Commonwealth public sector employers sort of gave us in that reasoning, so something to look at further. But I think I'm now handing over to Celeste again for GEI4.
Yeah, so GEI4 focuses on flexible work, parental leave, and support for carers. In the Commonwealth public sector, it's clear that employers are embracing a really broad range of flexible work options. You can see from the infographic that things like time in lieu, job sharing, purchase leave, and working from home are very common in the public sector. We know that there are different kinds of workforces across the public sector, people who work in offices, people who work in labs. So how that gets translated into the actual workplace is also a key consideration when we think about flexible work. But if we move on to parental leave, When looking at paid parental leave, 98% of employers reported that they offer this leave, but the majority offer parental leave using a distinction of a primary and secondary carer. This is in contrast to what we call universally available parental leave, which is where there's no distinction made between who is the primary carer, and it encourages all parents to be able to take parental leave and provide care for their families. Far fewer employers in the Commonwealth public sector offer this universally available parental leave compared to the private sector. We also see that 15% of employers reported that they only offer parental leave to primary carers leave, to women only, so not to men. This is possibly a remnant of the Maternity Leave Act, which we know has been reviewed over the last couple of years. And we anticipate that this is really a baseline data set with changes to come in the coming years following the review of the Maternity Leave Act, as well as the APS-wide bargaining that recently finalised. On the next slide, we see that there are differences between the who's taking the primary carers leave. So as a sort of overarching consideration, we know that there's a different amount of time that primary carers and secondary carers are able to take for leave. Primary carers on average have access to 14.5 weeks of leave, whereas secondary carers have on average 3.5 weeks. So that's quite a significant difference. What we see is that the majority of primary carers leave is taken by women. And this is a common trend across the public and the private sectors. Only 11% of men took universally available or primary carers leave in 2022. As you can see from this table, the numbers vary by employer type, with a higher percentage of men taking primary carers leave in Commonwealth companies at 42%. And that's quite a significant difference to some of the other entity types that we've disaggregated by. As I mentioned previously, we really hope to see some changes in this over the coming years as the type of leave available to men and women changes following the APS-wide bargaining process. And along with that, we're excited to see what employers are doing to help encourage and normalise men to take this leave, and also to support them when they're taking the leave and coming back into the workforce. Back to Camilla.
Thanks, Celeste. So GEI 5, we're looking at employee consultation. So the overall finding was that most employers are consulting employees on workplace gender equality, but few actually have policies on it. And that's what this graph is showing here. So 78% of employers are consulting with their employees about gender equality in the workplace. And that's a lot higher than in the private sector, where it's about 47%. But only 30% had specific policies on this GEI. And it's also important, that's important because of it being a requirement for relevant employers with 500 or more employees needing to have policies in place for each of our GEIs. And so that number hopefully will increase. So looking at the most common methods of consultation, things like surveys and consultative committees were very common. A lot of employers did also cite the APS census as a common method, but there were some underutilized consultation methods, things like exit interviews, performance discussions, and that's an area where the public sector could put some focus on to increase these consultation methods beyond what's already established, such as the APS census. So nice and brief from me, on to GEI 6.
GEI 6 is the last of our GEIs, and it focuses on prevention of workplace sexual harassment and discrimination. Similar to the private sector, we have a really high number of Commonwealth public sector agencies who have a policy or strategy in place relating to prevention of workplace sexual harassment and discrimination. But what we see is that of those who do have a policy, 83% have a grievance process contained within the policy or strategy, and that's a little bit lower than what we see in the private sector. The majority of employers are also providing training to their managers on the prevention of sexual harassment or discrimination, though we've observed that larger employers are more likely to provide this training than smaller employers. Something to note and prepare yourself for in the future is that we expect to see more change in this area. Respect at Work has given employers a renewed focus on preventing and responding to workplace sexual harassment. And as part of the Respect at Work report, recommendation 42 was specifically to WGEA and involves the inclusion of broader questions about how employers are preventing and responding to workplace sexual harassment. And we're hoping that this will help to increase some accountability about what employers are doing in terms of preventing these things, these behaviours. And it will also be hopefully useful to keep in mind the Human Rights Commission's positive duty, which their enforcement powers came into effect at the end of last year. So that's a very quick overview of some of the key findings across each of our 6 gender equality indicators. There is a lot more detail in the report itself, but as a bit of a wrap up, there are several areas where the Commonwealth public sector is performing really well, and we have discussed quite a few of them already. For example, the gender balance in the management levels is a real success story. The other thing that is really a great sign is the neutral gender pay gap for senior management levels, that key management personnel or SES bands 2 and 3. And also the way in which the public sector has embraced flexible working. There are also some areas where we can focus our attentions as a sector and as individual agencies. For example, there were very few employers setting targets at the agency level, but we've seen that targets can have a really great impact on workforce composition and things like that. There's also opportunity for increased focus on the non-manager workforce, which is a key driver of the gender pay gap in the Commonwealth public sector. So that's addressing this key driver that a lot of the male-dominated occupations are the higher paid occupations, so trying to get more women into those roles. And parental leave is another area where we're, I'm sure, going to see some rapid change in the coming years with the new enterprise bargaining entitlements that came out of the APS-wide bargaining process last year. This scorecard sets a benchmark for the Commonwealth public sector, and we really look forward to seeing and reporting on the future results, as well as gender pay gap publication in 2025. Now I'll hand back to Penelope to talk us through where we go from here.
Thank you, Camilla and Celeste, for sharing those results and for leaving us with that nice summary of those areas of relative success in the public sector, and also those 3 areas for action, which is what I'll pick up now. So I want to talk to you about how you can continue to advance gender equality in your organisation and also meet your changing legal obligations. So if we turn first to what can be done at an agency level, which is, that point that Celeste made, the public sector has been very successful at sector-wide change, and we've seen the results of that through the data Celeste and Camilla have shared today. And there's more work that can be done at the agency level because there is still a gender pay gap and there's still that gender imbalance in some of those different role types. So what's the first thing to do? We always say start by understanding your gender pay gap so that you can take targeted action to close it. And we know that this works. So from our private sector longitudinal data, we know that organisations that do a gender pay gap analysis and then do something as a result of that, because they now understand what's driving it in their organisation, they have twice the rate of improvement in their gender pay gap, where organisations that don't even do a gender pay gap, their pay gap tends to not move at all. So it's just a really obvious, an easy place to start. And we've got lots of information available for you to help you with that. So the reason this works is because it helps you understand what are the key drivers, in your organisation. Is it the case that, for example, there are more men in leadership roles, which tend to be more highly paid, and more women in junior roles? Is it the case that men are in those higher paid jobs, as Celeste was pointing out, that is a sort of feature of the Commonwealth public sector workforce, and women in lower paid occupations? Is there unequal participation in part-time work? and inequality in employee movements like promotions. So those are really common causes of the gender pay gap, and you can find out to what extent they apply to your organisation by doing the analysis. So we've got a gender pay gap analysis guide on our website that will walk you through those steps in a really simple way. And if you need further support, there are also masterclasses that WGEA makes available on gender pay gap analysis too. So really good place to start. And while 64% of employers in the public sector are doing this already, obviously many aren't. So it's a really easy win for those who are yet to get started on that journey. Also at the agency level, having done your gender pay gap analysis, you should plan targeted action to address those factors that you now understand are really the main drivers of gender pay gap in your organisation. So we've made available recently an action planning tool that you can use. You fill in a short survey and it sort of takes you straight to a suite of actions you can consider based on evidence we have of what works from here and overseas. So many of you have already got action plans in place and are doing really great work, and that's also great because we know that multi-year action is the key to success here. We know that from our longitudinal data in the private sector. So having an action plan in place and putting concerted effort into making that happen is the key to success. So that's at the agency level. Another thing you can do is to consider strengthening your policies and strategies. And while some of those are set at the sector level, there is still room to move at the agency level in many areas. So we've produced some guides on our website in terms of each of those gender equality indicators, what are the kinds of policies and or strategies you could put in place that could strengthen your performance in relation to each of those. So it's certainly worth considering whether there's more that could be done at an agency level, because again, from our data, we know that having a sort of holistic and comprehensive set of policies and practices in place is also a key to having a lower gender pay gap. So there are resources available to help you there. And importantly too, as mentioned already today, the new requirement for relevant employers with 500 or more employees to have a policy or strategy that addresses each of the 6 gender equality indicators means that you may be looking to do more than you have previously, because the existence of a public sector-wide strategy or policy doesn't actually equate to an organisational policy or strategy in relation to that requirement. And there's more on that under our reporting guide on the website as well. So that's at the agency level, things that you can do. There are some other things as well in relation to those challenges that Celeste mentioned that we wanted to flag. One is around encouraging men to take up primary carers leave. So I wanted to share one example with you there. We know when employers survey men who who may be considering parental leave or have taken or not taken it, and they understand what's behind their decision making. Often their decisions are made in relation to what they think other men think about taking paid parental leave, and they think that other men will judge them harshly. And there's been a couple of studies done in here and also overseas that have found that in a specific employer, that men believe they'll be penalised by their peers for taking paid parental leave. They'll be looked down on, but they're not right about that. When you survey them and say, what do you think about men who take paid parental leave? The vast majority say it's terrific. So the men have got a misperception about how they'll be judged by their peers. And once that misperception is corrected, you can tell them we've actually surveyed people and everyone thinks it's a great idea. That actually changes people's behaviour. And one company in Victoria that's done this, by just simply changing how they communicate that using their own data and saying, most men here support men taking paid parental leave, they saw double-digit increases in the rate of take-up of men's paid parental leave entitlements. So that's one example of the kinds of things you can do to not just have a policy in place around primary carers leave, but also encouraging men to take it up so they can participate as fully as they would like to in their families. Another example in relation to attracting women to those more highly paid professional and technical roles that we've seen is one of the areas of opportunity in the public sector. One example that has proven successful in the private sector is lateral career pathways. So, for example, if you find it's a very common problem to struggle to find gender balanced composition for women in technology. Well, people in technology tend to be men. It's very hard to get gender balance in that workforce. So one thing that many organisations have done is to look at how can we recruit women laterally, because there's a pipeline coming through from university or from other roles is not gender balanced. So how can we bring more women in who aren't coming through those pathways? And the answer is look for some of the skills that are useful in tech and elsewhere. Find them where they already are. Like, for example, project management is a skill that is very translatable into a technology role. So where are the project managers in our organisation now who are women, and how can we create pathways to give them the skills they need to get them into those tech roles that we're often struggling to fill because it's a really tight talent market there. So that kind of lateral career pipeline planning can be a pathway to that sort of struggle with getting women into those professional and technical roles. They also tend to be higher paid. So those are some ideas for the kinds of things that you can do. There's lots more on our website, of course, and we're always available to talk as well where employers would like to go a bit deeper. So before we move to the questions and answers that you are looking for, let me take the opportunity to remind you that reporting for the 2023 year will be commencing soon. So that will either be data that is transferred from the APSC and or reported directly to WGEA. The online reporting guide is currently being updated, and that will include all the templates that you require for reporting, including the popular offline version of the new questionnaire questions that you will fill out in the online portal. I know people find it very useful to get prepared even before reporting begins, so that's happening now. And also close to reporting, we'll have another webinar to take you through in more detail the process and small changes to the reporting process since the last round. So thank you in advance for your commitment to that process in 2020 for the 2023 year also. So let's move on to your questions.
Questions coming through there. Are you spotting them, Penelope, or do you want me to?
Why don't you keep going, Mary?
Right. So when should you submit your report? So as Penelope said, we will have a reporting webinar. The deadline for end of reporting submission will be the end of October. So that's why we try and put the offline questionnaire and spreadsheets up early so people can start preparing, but reporting will be open in September and October. And if you can, plan your work and your resources and your teams accordingly. The other thing that we've got is, as public servants, how can we advocate for action on workplace gender equality in our departments and agencies? And I'm sure the team might have some views in relation to that. I mean, I think the thing that's fantastic is that this is a significant focus for the government. It's what that translates to is a significant focus from the minister, who's our minister as the Minister for Women, Katie Gallagher, but also the Minister for the APS. And this, just in the last few days, she's on the back of the scorecard come out very clearly saying how she believes the APS should be a model employer in terms of a whole range of things, but including calling out gender equality and the importance to perform in relation to that. So you can see your individual results up on our Data Explorer for your agency. Your secretary, and you, if you're the reporting contact, will have that detail within it in terms of your executive summary and your benchmark report. So the potential to then engage on the substance of the issues within it. What are those reports highlighting? What do we need to dig into and do that pay gap analysis and look into in more detail? And while we have transparency and set things on pay rates, often it's composition that's driving the differentials in terms of those benefits. So, if it is trades and technicians, what is it within that in terms of the roles we have, and how can we then have strategies around, potentially recruiting more women to those roles? Or if we've got all our women in low paid roles, how do we think about recruiting, men into some of those roles and designing jobs in ways that can be interesting across all genders? There are a couple of thoughts about I think the environment is ripe for it. The government wants us to be performing well in this area. Our secretaries, our executives, our teams want to be performing well. And there's also great work happening at the APSC with some guides and advice around this too. So and connect back in with us. I'm not sure if there's anything else any of the team want to add in terms of that local advocacy.
Yeah, so I might add to that. I think so we've got the APS-wide gender equality strategy that I'm sure lots of you are familiar with. But a lot of agencies also have action plans that tailor that gender equality strategy to the specific context of your workforce, and that's really important. So looking into what exactly your agency is doing to promote gender equality under their action plans is a really great point to start. The other thing we know is that lots of departments and agencies have a gender equality network, which you could probably participate and join in. And anecdotally, I've also heard of agencies consulting key sort of work health and safety groups, for example, to look at how they can prevent workplace sexual harassment. So there might be different channels in your organisation that you can engage with to promote gender equality in different ways and across those different GEIs.
I also add, in terms of that employee network group, we're aware of some examples of some pretty influential employee network groups, so that it can be a very effective advocacy mechanism within the public sector, because it is about understanding what specifically is going to work in your agency, and then advocating for those very specific things at an agency level. So that's been very effective. We have a question here about report accessibility, which is something that I know we are working on. Mary, is that something you'd like to speak to? Looking at Daniel's question, we had concerns with the accessibility and formatting of the reports generated from our submission, which were required to be made available in the department, is being reviewed.
Yeah, and there's another reporting question. I'm happy to touch on both of them. And if any of those issues, hopefully you've fed back to the team as well, because we take all our feedback very seriously, and different people had different challenges. And that's part of the first year, but we definitely want to make sure those reports are, easy to access and formatted in a way that presents the information well as a leverage to getting action. So anyone who's had issues with accessibility or formatting, please make sure you drop us an email back as well, specifically telling us what your concerns are, and that absolutely gets fed in. The other question, just to satisfy on reporting. So once again, the first year we had things to improve, and we absolutely understand that. For this year's reporting, you will get your executive summary on submission once you lodge your report. So there won't be the reporting overview and the executive summary comes out later. That'll all be automated at the time. And we're working, and we're just working on timelines this morning to make sure your industry benchmark report can then come out as quickly as possible once reporting concludes. So we have to wait till we've got the full data set to then generate those benchmarking reports. But the time frame, we were generous and allowed extra time to get agencies over the line in terms of being able to report this year. The time frame will be much, will be tighter. We will stick to the expectation about the reporting in the 2-month period. We always have a month at the end to allow for data quality, the access, people can reopen their reports and fix anything in the 28 days post-submission. But after that, we'll then be in a position to make sure the industry benchmark reports come out as soon as possible afterwards. So, yeah, it'll be a tighter process this year, and we know that will make a difference for you as well.
Thanks, Mary. I'm going to Sophie's question now about encouraging male team members to utilise paid parental leave. And do we have examples of how to do this? Lizzie's posted one link in the chat which has one example, which is that Behavioural Insights example about addressing pluralistic ignorance, which is where you've got a mistaken belief about what everyone else thinks, and you make your own decisions based on that, which might be not to take up your full entitlement of paid parental leave. We do know that the organisations that have taken effective action have first sought to understand why men are not taking the paid parental leave available to them, and there can be a range of reasons for that. So sometimes it's about what's actually available to them, what they can get approval for, or it's about norms and decision making. So as a first step, it's really helpful to understand what is behind men's decision making in your organisation through some surveys, consultation, whatever means work for you. But there are certainly pathways to increasing that take up, which we've posted in the chat. Did you want to say more on that, Mary?
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation with some private sector employers recently about the idea that instead of being parental leave being something that you have to ask to take, the expectation is you take it and you actually have to ask not to take it. And it's an interesting shift in terms of the dynamic, because it gets, you build into the culture that it's an expected part of a career, and that's really important. The other really important aspect I'd like to highlight is what happens when people come back from parental leave. And I think there's some evidence in the public sector, as well as the private sector, that when people see predominantly women coming back from parental leave, finding it very challenging, that the workplace is not perhaps recognising the dramatic change that has in life for the employee, and created flexibility or other allowances and in relation to that, and that many people do leave, either don't return from parental leave or leave soon after, or may leave after a second or subsequent child. We have to make sure what happens on return is positive, inclusive, and enables them to continue their careers and their work. So, it's not just what happens on the way back in influences decision-making in terms of those taking it subsequently. So there's a lot of things to think about, and it goes to the point Penelope made, is understand why people aren't taking it, or the experience of those who do, and even some of the things, if people are leaving soon after they've returned from parental leave, what is it about the workplace that hadn't supported what they had hoped it would support, in terms of enabling them to be able to work and manage those caring responsibilities.
Thanks, Mary. There's a lot to be said too for having a senior man take paid parental leave in a very visible fashion. I think we've addressed the questions that I can see.
There's one from Adina who asks, will the public reporting program be moved to the same dates as the private sector? I'm happy to take that, or Mary?
There you go, Celeste.
Yeah, so we've been having lots of discussions about this internally. To develop and deliver the reporting program, there's a huge amount of work that comes in beforehand, and we're looking at how we can bring that forward. But one of the key challenges is that we want to keep working with our partners at the APSC to share the data that is available, and that the APSC already collects, so that we're reducing the reporting burden for employers. And that data can only be provided to us at a certain point in time. So at the moment, it doesn't look like that data is ready for us to be able to align the private sector and public sector reporting, but we're definitely having these discussions. Mary, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
And I think the challenge is we're trying to look for how we can bring it forward earlier in the year as much as possible, understanding you also have other reporting requirements at around year end and those sorts of things as well. But the Act purposefully recognised that there was a difference between the two programs, and with public sector the dates are specified in the Act, and with private sector, and with public sector that's a decision that I make each year based on doability. So we obviously have that aspiration, as Celeste's articulated, but just juggle some the management and the timing of it.